I was asked to say a few words about this conference, at first, I read this email and I went, what on earth would I say about this? And then I left it, and a couple of days later, a few thoughts started coming to mind that were sort of unexpected, not really what I was thinking about initially, but some things that give you a different perspective. Mayor Hawthorne's mentioned some of the reasons why Houston was picked. It was picked for more than he mentioned, a lot more than he mentioned. Houston had already held 2 major women's rights conferences in this city, okay? In fact, we probably have had more significant women's rights conferences in this city than any other city. We had held a very large national conference for the National Organization for Women in 72, 73, somewhere like that. My memory about which years are which is a little foggy. I was a conference coordinator on that conference. We had also held the first National Women's Political Caucus National Convention in Houston. Again, I'm bad on the dates, okay? Okay, but we had already had national conferences about women's rights in this city. You should have been there, Fred. You would have remembered. So we had already dispelled for a lot of national leaders the notion that they would have to ride a stagecoach from the airport. Which I promise you, there were some people from New York who seemed to think that. Those had both been very successful conferences, and the reason they were very successful was because we had a very active and involved women's rights movement in this city, okay? We had already passed, we passed a state equal legal rights amendment, okay? It passed 8-1 in Harris County. It passed 4-1 statewide. Can you imagine it even getting out of the Texas legislature today? I bet we couldn't even get a hearing. But we had a very vibrant and active, outspoken, radical women's rights movement in this city. So we were known as someone, and again, we had a mayor who was receptive and who had stepped out of line. Now, what else comes to my mind about being women's advocate and about this conference? Well, oddly enough, the first thing that comes to mind are police. One of the notable things about when Fred was mayor was that he had an unusually large number of police chiefs. He nods his head. I don't remember how many. Do you remember how many? 4, maybe 5. I mean, I remember some press event where some conference, something was going on, and Fred said, I've had whatever number of police chiefs. So, I mean, it was a turbulent time. Well, when I went in as women's advocate, well, first of all, when I interviewed with Fred, which he obviously doesn't remember, but I'm going to forgive him his senility. Anyway, I remember it quite well because he may not have had an agenda for that meeting, but I did, okay? I always had an agenda. Anyway, I went in and I told him what the women's advocate was supposed to do. And I had a list of about 10 or 12 things. And at the top of that list was the police department and the fire department, to get women into the police and fire department in mainstream functions. We had 0 women in the fire department, 0. And in the police department, which was a very large department and certainly very visible in our community, we had hardly any women. And the reason we had hardly any women, and certainly they were totally invisible, the ones that existed there, was because they were confined to 2 jobs. They could work in juvenile with children, surprise, or they could work as jailers with women prisoners in the Houston jail. I, being a radical, wanted women on patrol. I wanted them directing traffic. I wanted them doing everything that a regular police officer does, because otherwise, how are we going to get to have a woman chief of police? I didn't tell him that was my goal, okay? But I did mention the police department. One of the first meetings I had as women's advocate once I went down there was to meet with the first of his many chiefs of police. And to protect the guilty, I won't mention names, okay? And I tried to talk about women on patrol, and I quickly abandoned talking about that because it was pretty obvious that was a non-starter with this particular guy. But I found him willing to talk about taking the quota down on women officers. And the more I talked with him, the more sort of amazed I was, because he apparently thought that wouldn't really represent any kind of change in the police department. I remember having dinner that night after the meeting and telling a friend of mine about this meeting that I had with the police chief and how he was willing to drop the quota entirely in the upcoming police classes, and saying to my friend, he thinks women don't want to be police officers. He thinks this will not make a difference. Well, the first class that was picked after that, there were 7 women in that class of about 50-something. There had never been 7 women in a police class before. There had never been more than 1 or 2. They had another. We were hiring a lot of police because we were understaffed. The next class after that had 14 women in it. And I kept thinking, this guy's going to realize what's happening. It takes about 6 months for him to get out of the pipeline. But he apparently, this police chief, didn't quite realize what was going on. The next class after that had 21 women. That's darn near half, okay? At that point, we had more women in the police academy than they had in the whole department of the Houston Police Department. And I'm sitting there on whichever floor I'm on, every time a new class is selected, looking at these numbers and going, I mean, when are they going to realize they're out of women's jobs? I mean, when is somebody over there going to snap? Well, the next class after that had 27 women. And at that point, women start coming out the other end of the pipeline, right? And at that point, it was that long before they began to realize, my God, there are women coming out of the police academy. What the hell are we going to do with them? And, you know, they slammed it down. But the thing is that the dam had already been broken because they had now already more than doubled the number of women in the police department. And at that point, they had to do something with them. So they started directing traffic. First time anybody's seen women directing traffic. And eventually they did go on patrol, not that long later, okay? And the dam was broken. But at one point, going back to this police chief, he had a conversation with me in which he told me that I needed to be sure and lock my car when I was parked at the city or anywhere else, because the police officers were so mad at me, they might plant dope in my car. Fortunately, that did not happen. I had another conversation about improving the treatment of rape victims with a police chief. Not a police chief, an assistant chief, okay? We had a state law saying that the law enforcement agency was supposed to pay for the collection and processing of rape kits. This was not happening. We had fought hard as women's advocates to get that state law passed, because what was happening to rape victims is they would be sent a bill to have their rape kit processed. No other crime victim was sent a bill. Anyway, I had a meeting with this deputy chief over there, and boy, was that a consciousness raiser for me, explaining how we really had to do this. It is a state law. And he proceeds to tell me that if the Houston Police Department paid for the processing of rape kits, that women would falsely report rapes in order to have a rape exam. I'm not kidding. I can't, no woman in this room would believe that that is a remote possibility. But that indicates the kind of attitudes that we were facing from the police. Still in our Hoffance's term, now we're up to one of the later police chiefs, I don't remember which. I'm no longer a women's advocate. I've been hired as a special conference coordinator from the Department of State to help put this conference together. So we're very close to the women's conference coming by. And I have a meeting with the then chief of police because we have a lot of security issues. We've got first ladies coming. We have, you know, international figures coming from all over the world. And the first thing he says to me is, I won't work with you unless I have a court order. Because he believed it was a plot to sue him for sex discrimination. So we had a lot of support in this administration from this man, but we didn't always have a lot of support everywhere. The conference went on, it was a wonderful success. Actually, the police did begin to work with us, but it was definitely a challenge throughout, and we still face this challenge. I'm happy to tell you that we did end up with a woman chief of police a little later, and we now have women in full service functions throughout the police department, and we also have women in the fire department, but still underrepresented. We have a long way to go, but the women's conference was a turning point in many ways, and Mayor Hoffance's administration was a turning point in many ways. I wish y'all could have been there. Many women who went said it changed their lives.